The second chapter of Daniel has been called really the backbone of biblical prophecy, right? And I think one of the reasons is what it does is it lays a foundation that we are to build upon if we are going to understand prophecy, but especially the book of Revelation. So there's going to be a foundation that is laid that we build upon to get this understanding of what in the world is taking place in Bible prophecy. And what we're going to see as we begin this is what God has a tendency of doing and what God is still doing is he's taking us from troubles to triumph, right? If you look at the book of Revelation, you see great trouble there, but yet that's not where it ends. It doesn't end with troubles. It ends with God's triumphant victories in our life, right? How he is triumphant in our life. And so in this chapter, what we're going to see is how the God of Israel uses every situation to accomplish his purpose. That even our troubles, even the things that we struggle with, even our trials, God uses those things for his purpose. And what we're going to see is that he's going to show us some of the divine activities that lead to our triumph, that bring glory to his name, right? Because at the end of it all, God's not just victorious and triumphant so that, we can say we're on the winning team and we can wear the t-shirt and buy the hat and all that stuff. No, he's triumphant so that he could receive glory for his faithfulness in our lives in those times of trouble. And that's what we're going to see today. And this is why when Joseph said to his brothers, what Satan meant for bad, God intended it for good. Right? When they sold him there and he ended up in Egypt, or when Paul said that God works all things together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, right? God works all things. What we need to note, though, is that God didn't say that all things were good. And I think sometimes we get caught up thinking, well, yeah, all things are good, right? But what God is going to show us as we study his words is he sees our troubles. And he recognizes that they're not good. Those are not necessarily good things that we are experiencing. And he recognizes that and he gives value to that. But what we're going to see is how he shows up in the midst of our troubles and does good things. We need to understand that it is difficult to see the good when we're up to here in troubles. When all we're doing is just treading water to get a breath. It's hard to see how God is doing good things when our trouble is very real. So how do we do that? In times of very real trials, how do we see the goodness of God working and manifesting it and playing itself out in our lives? And if we're honest, I'm sure that there's some of you here today that are experiencing very real troubles. And you're probably wondering how God is going to use this for good in your life. How is this going to be used for anything good? And I really believe this. That today, one of the things that God wants to do is he wants to begin to turn your troubles into triumph. That he wants to bring about a great victory. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to get a clear understanding of what troubles look like. Right? We're going to kind of define it in the first few verses. We're going to see it laid out for us. But then what we'll look at is how triumph begins to take place in our life. And then we will look at the end result where triumph takes us to when we get this, this great victory in our lives. We will begin to understand what triumph looks like. And I think you'll see it looks a little bit different than what it's been paraded around as today. And so that being said, in Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, we're going to get an understanding of troubles. We're going to understand what it means. And so starting in verse 1, it says, "Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. So it starts off by Nebuchadnezzar having this dream. And this dream troubled him. And we're told here that he had dreams. And what this is suggesting to us is that he had this dream that was reoccurring. Have you ever had one of those? Those reoccurring dreams? And you often wonder, why am I having that? What is the significance to that dream? Well, that's exactly what was going on here. That's kind of the backdrop, this dream that was coming over and over and over to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, back in the day, dreams were thought of to be the future casting down a shadow. So as he was having this dream, what he was thinking is, what's going to take place later on? What is coming down the pipeline in my life? But the results of these dreams give us some insight to troubles, right? And the first insight we get to troubles is this: troubles will impact you both physically and emotionally. Nebuchadnezzar lost sleep and was anxious. He dealt with anxiety. Sound familiar? Sounds a lot like what's going on in the world today. We're anxious of what the future brings, right? We're wondering, am I going to lose something or am I going to gain something? What's going to take place? And lots of people have lost sleep over this. Or lots of people I know are very anxious trying to find answers to what's going on. And oftentimes, these are a result of not knowing the outcome of something that's heavy on our heart, isn't it? I got something that's just burning there and I don't know. Or it's from fear of losing what I hold dear. And they lead to these sleepless, anxious nights. How much of your free mental time, if you have much of that time where you're not really focused on an activity or anything like that, how much of your free mental time that's not devoted to a specific activity, is spent wondering about your past or worried about your future? Wondering, how could God love me? Or why would God love me? Is this a result of or what's coming down the pipeline? We spend lots of time wondering those things, leading to really these sleepless and anxious nights. It goes on in verse 4. We're going to get a little more understanding of troubles. It says, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servant the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your house shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretations. Sounds a bit harsh, don't you think? Like, tell me the dream. If you don't, I'm going to cut you to pieces and burn your house. I bet you these guys were a little bit anxious, right? But before we look at that, before we look at what he did, there's an interesting term here that we're told, and there's something that God points out. It says, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Why in the world would God record that for us to know? What's the significance of that? And I'm glad you asked me that question, right? But what's the significance of here Aramaic? And because what we need to understand is this. Chapter 1 and chapters 8 through 12 in the book of Daniel are written in Hebrew. But chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was the known language of the world back then. So why the change of speech? Well, in chapters 2 through 7, what we're going to see is prophecies that deal with the Gentile timeline in human history. So God speaks to them in a way that they will understand. in terms that would make sense to them. He communicates out of love for a Gentile people what he's about to do and why he's about to do it, with the hopes that they would then put their faith in the God that is defined in the Bible. When he goes back to Hebrew, in chapters 8 through 12, what we see is that those are the prophecies that deal with Israel and God's chosen people. So he begins to speak to them in terms and in ways that they would understand, which gives us insight to the heart of God. God will always communicate to you in a way that you can understand, in terms that you can comprehend. He doesn't leave it a mystery, right? But now let's look at troubles. And here's another fact about troubles. When you look at this guy and where he was, what you see is he was troubled, right? Nebuchadnezzar was troubled because of this dream. But his troubles, he then did what? He transferred them to those people that were around him and that were closest to him, right? You see, oftentimes the people who are transferring their troubles say things like this: if you don't, ... then I will, ... And what are they doing? They're taking their burdens and their troubles and they're casting them on somebody else, saying, I want you to fix my problem. I want you to be the answer to my problem, which God can only be the answer to. But that's what happens in times of trouble. We oftentimes begin to transfer our troubles on other people. And then we say, but if you do them, then I'll give you good gifts. I'll reward you for being such a good person, for worshiping me as God and giving me what I wanted, right? Isn't that what happens? That's what he's saying here. You see, it's very tough living in the if you, then I world. And God understands that. You see, God is communicating to us in a way that we can understand this one thing. God understands the troubles that we all face. He understands what you're going through. And he gives value to you, and what he's going to want you to know is that he wants to walk through those troubles with you. You see, when we try to cast our troubles, those requests are only adding to your troubles that you already face. And they're troubles that are impossible for you to fulfill. We go on in verse 7 to get a little more understanding about troubles, right? They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Went from bad to worse, don't you think? Like, good morning, thank you very much. We're done. Like, my life is over because I can't do what you've asked me to do. But again, we get some understanding to troubles here, right? What do troubles do? But troubles lead us to this lack of trust and a feeling of inadequacy, right? Nebuchadnezzar didn't trust the astrologer and the Chaldeans and those guys felt inadequate to do what the king asked them to do. But that's what troubles do in us. That's what they reveal. that reveals our lack of trust and our feeling of inadequacy. Troubles often end in destruction of something or someone, right? Now, I've never claimed to be the sharpest tool in the shed, but I remember when I would get troubled in high school and I'd get mad and angry and I would want to do something. We had an almond tree in the backyard. And me and my, meathead mentality thought, I've got a way to solve my troubles, and I'd go and I would punch this almond tree. Don't do that. You will lose 100% of the time. Like, that's what I found out, right? But how many of us, out of our troubles and our frustration, tend to deal with it by breaking things or making people feel inadequate or hurting ourselves or someone else? Here's these king's men who were brought there to be able to give the king some answers. And you know what? They would spend all their time, they spent their whole lives trying to reach God, right? Trying to do enough so that God would be pleased with them in the hopes to alleviate some of their troubles. That's what they did. But this book isn't a book that reveals to us the results of us reaching God and making God happy with us, making ourselves acceptable to God, where he deals with my troubles, right? This book reveals to us what happens not when we can reach God, but when God left heaven and met us in the midst of our troubles. That's the gospel. That's the good news. These guys said, what? This can't happen because the gods don't dwell in flesh. But what we're going to see is that, you know what? Jesus is our Emmanuel, our God who is with us. And he does dwell with us. John 1:14 tells us this. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. I love that last phrase. In describing Jesus, what we're told is that he was full of grace and truth. We love the first part. We love God's grace, right? Because that's when I get something I don't deserve. Like, who doesn't like gifts, especially if you don't deserve it? We want that. But he was not only full of grace, not only full of gifts, but he was full of truth. And what this does is it gives value to the troubles that you face. God says, I'm not going to overlook your troubles. I'm not going to overlook your circumstances. I'm not going to overlook your hard times as if they don't exist. He says this, I'm going to recognize that you are human and that you go through difficult times in your life. And I am going to meet you at your worst moment, at the hardest times in your life. And I'm going to show up because I love you. And I'm going to offer you something that will help you not necessarily remove yourself from those troubles, but I'm going to walk with you in those troubles because I care about you. That's the heart of God. The heart of God is a God that left heaven and came to earth to walk with us, to be our Emmanuel. That we could do what? Leave earth and go to heaven where he is. You see, Jesus left heaven to come to earth that we would be able to leave earth and go to heaven and spend eternity with him. Jesus is our Emmanuel. He is our God who is with us, even in the midst of our very real troubles that we face. Now that we have an understanding of troubles, let's get some hope. Let's look at how those troubles begin to turn into triumph. Triumph begins by taking risks. That's what we're going to see in verses 13 through 18. In verse 13, we read this. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Wow. He sought Daniel. So obviously Daniel didn't know what was going on, but what this reveals to us is this. Daniel himself was not immune to trials and troubles, right? Just because you give your life to the Lord Jesus Christ and are saved doesn't mean you will be void of trials in your life, that you are immune to the troubles that this world brings you. But how we handle the trials is everything. And how we handle troubles is how we begin to experience triumph, how the victory comes. You see, Daniel took a great risk going before the king that wanted him dead, don't you think? Like, if somebody wanted to take my life, I'm not taking that person to lunch. That's just how it is. Like, you don't do that. Like, somebody wants to take you out, you stay away from that person as much as you can. Like, you put a GPS on their car, whatever, right? You do what you can to avoid that person. Not Daniel. Daniel took a risk. He knew that his life and the lives of other people around him really were counting on Daniel taking risks. They needed Daniel to take a risk. His approach was everything, right? He took counsel, he sought wisdom, and then he went and he approached the king. And it's not just what he said that mattered, it's the way that he said it, right? Because it's not just what we say, but it's how we say it that makes a difference. Proverbs 25:11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Right? What we say matters, but how we say it is just as important. With spiritual wisdom, he went. But what is spiritual wisdom? Spiritual wisdom is having discernment while being sensitive to and aware of the kind of behavior a child of God should have in various circumstances. You see, spiritual wisdom leads to a discerned life that lives the way it should, regardless of the circumstances that we face. And it's going to be ever changing. We got to look at circumstances and we got to respond accordingly. Proverbs 15 verses 1 and 2, we read this. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. We need to be wise. And here Daniel is, taking risks, going into the throne room to the king who wanted to kill him. Why was he able to do that? How in the world did Daniel get that courage? Well, Daniel knew he needed to go in that throne room if his life was going to make a difference. But Daniel also knew that that wasn't the most important throne room to go into. You see, Daniel was able to go into the throne room of King Nebuchadnezzar because he had already gone into the throne room of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords to pray. Because prayer marked his life. He knew that if God was going to show up and give the interpretation, he had to go back into that throne room, right? And he had to pray. Daniel wasn't afraid to go into the King of Kings throne room because he had already spent ample time with Jesus. If we want to experience triumph in our life, It's going to come by taking risks, by going into the throne room of the King of Kings and saying, you know what, Jesus? I don't know how you're going to change the situation. I don't know how you're going to make things better, but I know that you can, and I want you to use me to do something that I can't do. And in he goes. His risks led him to prayer. Or more appropriately, his prayer life led him to taking risks. I have a tendency to think that this was probably a pretty powerful prayer meeting with his three buddies, don't you think? I mean, they were probably praying as if their life depended on it. Oh, wait a minute, it did. Their life literally depended on God showing up. Right? They needed what? What did they ask for? They didn't ask for God's grace to be sufficient. No, they asked for what? The mercies of God to show up in the way of a revelation from God. That's what they wanted. They didn't say, God, you know what? I deserve great gifts. No, they understood that what they deserved was a result of the wages of sin, which is death. And what they needed is to not get what they did deserve at that moment. And they needed God to show up with his mercies in the form of a revelation. And they said, God, show us your mercies. Show us your mercies. Make your mercies known. Will you put your faith on the line by taking risks and asking God to show up mercifully in your life? That your life might impact the world around you, the people that are closest to you, the people that are experiencing the same troubles that you're facing. You see, Daniel didn't do this just for his life. He did it for the life of everybody else that was involved. He did it for the lives of all the guys that came into Babylon with him when they were brought captive. He was interceding for people, not just himself. His heart broke for other people. So let's be a church that puts our faith on the line and takes risks. Asks God to show up, that we might experience the mercies of God, which lead to great triumphs that Jesus himself can produce. Let's ask God to do things that only he can do. I mean, when was the last time that you prayed for something that you couldn't handle, that you couldn't fix, that you needed God to show up and do something and bring his mercies to? Triumph begins by taking risks. Now in verses 19 through 23, what we're going to see is the result of God's triumph, the result of what he does in our lives. Verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. I love that. You see, the result of God's faithfulness, the result of the triumph that God brings in our life, the result of their prayer was worship. You see, when God shows up and does what only God can do, we should worship him because he's worthy of our worship. You see, Daniel, in the middle of his trials, he sought God, and the result of seeking God was this revelation of his mercies, which led Daniel to be a worshiper of God Almighty. What's interesting to me is notice how his worship comes out, right? The secret was revealed. And then what does he do? He blesses the God of heaven. And he names all these things that God has done and God can do, and how he never changes, how he's always faithful. You see, we need to be people who, when God pours out his mercy, like he did to Daniel, we respond in worship. This was a response to the mercy of God being revealed to Daniel in times of trial and troubles. And when you look at Bible prophecy and you see what's going to take place, the troubles that are coming, what we need to understand is we need to understand God's mercies. We need God to show up in the midst of trying times if we're going to understand Bible prophecy. God doesn't just allow bad things to happen for the sake of bad things to happen. He uses it to reveal his mercies and his faithfulness and his love, to give us hope in hopeless situations, that we would worship him. We need to be those who pray so hard for something that when the answer comes, we don't forget who was the one who was faithful in the situation. And we give God the worship. Worship needs to mark our life, and it should go hand in hand with prayer. You see, when the world is facing difficulties, what we need to do is see those as our opportunities. Our opportunities to do what Daniel did and pray for our nation, pray for a people, and seek the opportunities where God's mercies could be, input into those situations, that people could see that there is a God whose name is Jesus, who is our God with us, our Emmanuel, who wants to meet them in the midst of their troubles and their trials, and show his faithfulness and bestow his mercies, to show himself faithful to them. We need to look around and realize that, there are people out there that say, there's so much going on in the world around us that I just don't have time to pray. I don't have time to worship. You ever heard that one? This might sting a bit, but that's the voice of Judas. That's the voice of Judas. You remember when Mary came and offered that flask of alabaster oil and began to anoint Jesus? Judas pipes up and says, that money could have been used for something better. We could have fed the poor. We could have done something better with that. What does Jesus say? Well, the poor will be with you always. But then he goes on and he says, what she is doing shall be spoken of throughout the world wherever the gospel is preached. Mark 14:9. Her act of worship will be spoken of by taking that alabaster bottle of oil and anointing Jesus with it. Will be spoken of wherever the good news is preached. And I would say this, if you've watched any amount of news or read any social media posts, you would have to ask yourself this: how do I not have time to pray? How would I not have time to pray? You see, you don't have time not to pray with what's going on in the world around us. We live in a world that is hopeless. We live in a world that people are wondering, what am I going to lose? Whose fault is it? Is this a result of the sins of my past? Or what's going to be taken away from me in the future? What's going to happen here and now? And we got people that are in troubles, troubles are very real. And what God says is, what I'm looking for is people that will pray that I can reveal my mercies to, that they would see people and see the world with a broken heart the way that I see it, and that they would interject my mercies, that they would show up and present my mercies through faithfulness and faithfully showing up and loving them. Troubles are difficult. They are hard. That's why they're called trouble. That's why they're called difficulties. But God says this, I understand those troubles that you go through. I understand your difficulties. I understand your trials. And I want you to know this, that through my mercies, I will show up faithfully and I will be with you in the midst of those. And that's not a message that you're going to see on social media or on the news. But that's a message that we need to live out. You see, like Daniel, Mary was a worshiper and the Lord commended her for it. As a church, we need to actively seek for opportunities to bring the hope of Jesus Christ to our community. To love the unlovable, to love those that are hurting, to love the people that we rub shoulders with, our friends, our families, our co-workers. Because the one thing I know about troubles is it's no respecter of persons. There's not an economic line, that if you get past this economic line, you're void of troubles. It's there for everybody, but we have hope. You see, we need to be those who are willing to stand in the gap for the people in our lives. And we need to pray. And I just pray that it won't be said of us what was said in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 22, verse 30. When God said this, so I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found no one. You see, people have questions that they're not able to answer. They have questions that the world is not sufficient to answer. They have questions that they're hoping that you and I will answer. You see, we are all stewards. According to verse 22, we're stewards of what? The mercies of God that God has made known to us. You see, we have the answers, and we need to be ready to give an answer to the hope that lies within us. That's what Paul tells us. You see, trouble paves the way for triumph. It does. It paves the way. You see, people's troubles are what God uses to reveal himself as Emmanuel. I believe this, that today if you're experiencing troubles, that today could be the day that God begins the process of something triumph in your life. That God wants to bring you triumph in your troubles. That he wants to work like only he can. And he wants you to understand his mercies. We need to be thankful that God is refining something within us, revealing something to us, or renewing something within us. That he's doing something in our lives, that he's showing up faithfully. 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 and 2 tells us this. Let a man not consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. You see, what the world is hoping is that we will be found faithful stewards of the mysteries and the mercy of God. That's what the world is hoping. And again, we come to the place where it'd be very easy for me to tell you, here's what you need to do. You need to be like Daniel. Be like Dan. Dan's the man, right? And you know what? That wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, to be like Daniel. But, once again, I'm not going to tell you to be like Daniel. I'm going to tell you this. Look to Jesus. In the midst of trials and troubles and hardships, look to Jesus. And what you will see is you'll see how he separated himself to be committed to the will of the Father, to do God's will. That you will see that Jesus didn't add to you his troubles, his burdens, but Jesus lived with an expectation that God would not let him down, that he could trust him, that God would show himself faithful. And in so doing, Jesus associates with what? He associated with our desperation, with our trials and our troubles by taking them upon himself. So instead of putting his troubles on you, what did he do? He took your troubles from you and placed them on himself. And he took them to the cross and he nailed them there so that he could tell you that as your Emmanuel, he understands the significance and the pain and the sorrow of your troubles and trials and desperation. He knows what you're going through. And then he communicated with us the fullness of what? The love that the Father has for us, the mercies of God, the grace of God, because Jesus was the embodiment of God's mercies. Guys, don't be like Daniel. Look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is our triumph. It's that simple. Jesus is our triumph. And he still is triumphant today. So may we be those that look to Jesus to turn our troubles into triumph, that we would experience his mercies today.